Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Neighbor from Hell, submitted by Tilo Bombastic. I heard one of your podcasts about a guy who tried to harass a kid next door and poison his dog. I think that's the way it went. So I thought I would share my story. Before I went off to college, my parents moved into a neighborhood that was predominantly white. And this is not about race because I am African American. And everyone in the neighborhood was really cool and actually friendly. We knew a number of people there as well. But this couple across the street were by far the epitome of the neighbors from hell. They were both in their 60s, and everyone on our block hated them. They went out of their way to be the biggest assholes they could be. And it seemed like they went out of their way to harass my mom and dad, too. Anything anyone did in the neighborhood that they didn't like heard about it, including screaming in the evening hours, and they always stayed in their own yard for the most part. Except to park like jackasses in front of other people's driveways. I mean, seriously, they did things like that. They would park one of their cars like halfway across a driveway and say it had to be there because they had someone coming over to work on their house. I mean, mind you, they could have just parked their car in front of their house, but they always blocked our driveway or our neighbors' driveways. And half the time, no workers ever showed up. And one time, I distinctly remember seeing them just sitting on their porch watching their car. One night, I was playing my guitar out in our garage around 9 o'clock. The guy across the street, I'll call him Joe, came to the edge of our driveway and started screaming his head off that I needed to stop playing, and that I wasn't allowed to be doing that. This was the middle of summer, and everyone had their garage doors open and were doing different things, working on their cars or whatever. I wasn't even playing loudly at all. He threatened to call the cops and his lawyer, which, as a snot-nosed 16-year-old, I just started laughing at. He then threatened to go get his gun, and turned around, and that's when I went inside and told my dad what had just happened. My dad ran outside right up to his door and started ringing the doorbell and banging on it. Joe and his wife, suddenly, were not home. I heard my dad say something like, "If you ever threaten my kid again, you better hope the police get here before I get to you." Probably not the smartest thing to say, but man, my dad was pissed. A few days later, our friends that were a kitty cat corner across the street next to Joe and his wife were out doing some yard work. This was always a mistake when the two neighbors from hell were home. It was always risky doing anything outside because these two nuts would come out and scream at you. I mean, if you were just doing your lawn work, they would come out and scream at you. If you were too loud or too close to their property, they would go insane. Our friend across the street and next door to Joe, I'll call him Dave, was just cutting his grass along the property line, and out comes Joe's wife, of course. I'll call her Betty. Over the lawnmower, we could hear her screaming, even in our house with the windows and doors closed. She was going completely ballistic and yelling that he was out cutting the grass too short and that it would look different than theirs and they had to cut it the same way. Dave shut off the lawnmower as I opened the front door to get a view of what was going on, and she was just screeching and waving her arms. She finally stopped to take a breath, and Dave, as politely as he could, said, "I'm allowed to cut my grass any way that I want, and I'm not on your property. I'm sorry if you don't like that." She screamed out, "Fuck you!" and then stormed into her garage. Dave just stood there, but she came back a second later with a rake in her hand. Not like a plastic leaf rake, but one of those garden rakes, the steel kind. She started jabbing it in Dave's direction, still screaming her head off. I saw Dave's wife get on her phone while all this was happening, but Dave was standing his ground. Dave kept telling her that if she hit him with that rake, he was going to sue her, but she said he couldn't because she was on her property, and the air was public property where she was waving the rake. Yeah, again, these people were fucking cooked. Finally, she went back inside the house, closed the garage door, and a few minutes later a police car showed up. There was a conference with our friendly neighbors, and then they all drove off. My dad went over and talked to Dave for a while. So, yeah, this was like normal stuff. When I say that this happened every day, it probably happened more than once a day. Then things started to get a little more awful, and that's when everyone in the neighborhood decided to start a block club after a little girl got hurt on their front sidewalk. And like all kids, they like to ride their bikes up and down the street, on the sidewalk. And this little girl, she was maybe 7 or 8, was riding up and down when Joe came out to scream at her that she couldn't do that. Of course, she's a little girl. She burst into tears and left her bike and ran home. I didn't see this, but my sister did because she was out in the front yard playing with another friend. They watched as Joe picked up this little girl's bike and threw it into the middle of the street. Of course, the father came down to see what the hell was going on. He saw the bike, picked it up, calmly got onto his phone, and started walking back to his house. You guessed it, the police came back out. This time they went over to talk to Joe, but he denied doing any of it and said that he watched the little girl just throw her bike into the street and run away. Nobody was buying that bullshit story, especially when my sister yelled over that that's not what happened. Joe suddenly lost his composure in front of the cops. He called my little sister a whore and shook his fist at her. The cops immediately put him in handcuffs and walked him to their car. They didn't take him away and they didn't arrest him. I think they were just trying to scare him. Of course, that didn't work, because that night Joe, and I don't know who else would have done this, sprinkled a bunch of broken glass bottles onto the front sidewalk in front of his house. The next morning, pretty early, another little girl was riding her bike up and down the sidewalk and fell onto some of the glass, and it cut her hands up pretty good. And her screaming was just as horrific as Betty's. This time the cops did come back and arrested Joe, who said he had nothing to do with it, but when he was told that his sidewalk was to be maintained by him no matter what happened to it, we were all thankful that Joe was going away for at least a few hours. Too bad for us, after he was hauled away, out came Betty and started blaring a radio that was playing that Lee Greenwood song, Proud to be an American. She would play it over and over and over, just rewinding the cassette tape and then play it again every time that the song stopped. Our noise laws don't go into effect until 10 p.m., so there really wasn't much we could do. But somebody did call the cops anyway, and of course they came back out. She started screaming at them to get off her property, and they told her that she either had to turn the music down or go inside, or she was going to visit her husband. She screamed out her trademark, "Fuck you!" and then went back into the house with her radio. The worst thing that happened was something that I've heard happening in other stories on YouTube or podcasts around the Halloween time. Everybody in the neighborhood always did cool stuff to their houses on holidays, no matter what it was. But this one year, Joe and Betty decided to hang a bunch of nooses from their front tree in the middle of their yard. I mean, no people or dolls in them or anything, just a bunch of nooses. Of course, being African American, my family kind of took offense to that, and we made a complaint, but there was nothing anybody could do about it because it was their property. About a week later, everybody got a piece of paper in their mailbox with a list of people that needed to leave the neighborhood. All kinds of people. Older folks, younger folks, people from all walks of life, creeds, and colors, including my family. It wasn't signed by anyone. There were a lot of misspellings, but we all knew where that came from. That winter, the snowblower war started. Some people in my neighborhood had plow services, but some of us either shoveled or used a snowblower to clear the driveway from snow. Joe took it upon himself to go up and down the sidewalks and blast snow into everyone's yards. And think about the apron that goes to the street, between the sidewalk and your driveway. He would literally go to neighbors' houses and blow all of the snow from the aprons into people's driveways, no matter how deep or wet it was. Made it a giant pain in the ass for everybody to clear their driveway. Of course, this pissed off a lot of people. And again, there was another meeting of the block club to confront Joe on his behavior. I remember it was a cold day and there was snow on the ground, and a group of dads went over in front of his house with a bullhorn and started yelling at him about his behavior, and that no one was going to be putting up with it any longer. He and Betty came out onto the porch and started yelling back that they can do whatever they want, it's a free country. The last straw was when he said to my dad, "This neighborhood was great before you N-word people moved in." My dad is a successful business owner, and he took it in stride. But he grabbed the megaphone and told them that if one more thing happened, we weren't calling the police anymore, and their trouble would ensue. Joe just said, "Get off my property," even though they were all standing on public property, and my dad said the same threat again. Joe yelled back, If I see that kid of yours outside making any more noise, you're going to have trouble and I will be calling the cops. My dad said if you lay one finger on any person in this neighborhood, I will personally break your arm. Everyone knew that my dad meant it. Well, the cops did show up because Joe and Betty called them, and my dad had to account for the conversation that they'd had. The cops were pretty cool about it and said, just don't engage them, try to ignore them, but if any kid or anyone else does get hurt, we need to call them immediately. I should also mention that Joe and Betty didn't even get along. We would hear them screaming at each other all the time. I mean, whether they were in their house, in the yard, or in their garage, they were constantly yelling at each other. Super nice people, huh? It finally ended on its own. Joe was out in his yard that spring and suffered either a stroke or a heart attack. I mean, I don't wish that on anyone. But the crazy part of the story was that we're pretty sure Betty saw it happen and did nothing. She just let him go right there on the front lawn. Thank goodness no kids or other neighbors were around to see that, but I was told that someone driving by did see him after they noticed Joe laying there. They also saw Betty just standing in the front door looking out. Of course, when Dave across the street came outside, he noticed and ran over to try to help Joe, but Joe was already gone. Dave's wife called the police and let them know what happened, and Dave did see Betty standing there and kept motioning her to come out, but Betty kept shaking her head. Then he just started telling her, you need to call the police, and she kept shaking her head. So that kind of ended it, and after a while I was off to college. Halfway through my freshman year, my mom called just to say hi and then mentioned that Betty had moved out and the house across the street was up for sale. Eventually, a new couple moved in, and they're really nice. I don't know where Joe went after he passed away, but I'm wondering if it spelled out H-E double hockey sticks. I really don't care where Betty is. That screeching voice was enough for me to never want to hear from her again. I hope this is appropriate for your channel. Campground Creeps, submitted by Angel. My name is Angel, and this happened to me when I was 14. My family owned a trailer at a campground at a lake. Now, actually, it was more like two big ponds, but people had their own places with decks and drove around on golf carts, all that kind of stuff. We had a store, a rec hall, you could rent paddle boats, that kind of scene. There also was an area smaller for campers and tents for people who didn't want to stay for every season. It was a lot of fun going there every summer, and a lot of times my mom and brother and me would stay for an entire month while my dad traveled back and forth to work. One time we were just going for a week, and I asked to take my girlfriend Julie along. It looked like a fun week because my brother was not going to go, and it would just be kind of like a ladies' trip. Sounded great in the beginning, and it was until that first Tuesday. Now that I think of it, my brother and father went to the Football Hall of Fame on their own. That's why they weren't there. That Tuesday after we arrived, Julie and I were hanging out in the rec hall playing ping pong and just laughing and talking about guys and things like that. We were the only ones there until all of a sudden, two guys walked through the door. We didn't recognize them as they were not part of the group of people who stayed at the campground all the time, and we figured they were just visiting or had one of the smaller campsites. They didn't say anything at first, but kind of just looked at us, and then went to play some video games. After about a half an hour, they came over and one of them said, "My name's Chris. Would you guys like to shoot some pool?" The other guy stepped up and said, "Hi, I'm Brad." They were both cute, and Julie and I giggled and said, "Yeah, sure." We started to play guys versus girls, and we asked them where they were from and where they were staying. The two guys said they were just from out of state while camping with their family. And then I should mention the campground was right on the border between two states. Now, I'm not going to say which states they were because I don't think it really matters. We hung out with both of them for most of that morning before going home to lunch, and they asked if we wanted to get together later that afternoon and go out on the kayaks on one of the ponds. We both thought they were really nice guys, and they figured it would be fun as we didn't have anything else to do. To be honest, there weren't a lot of kids during the week at this campground. So we met up with them and went out on the pond and had fun splashing each other and trying to race around or avoid ramming into each other. Everything was really nice, and they seemed like really good guys. That night, my mom took us out to dinner at a place a little ways away from the campground, and when we got back, we were just going to have a campfire. My mom wanted to just watch TV, but helped us get things started and then went inside. A little while later, Chris and Brad made their way over to our campsite, which at first I thought was odd because I didn't recall telling them where our site was. But then again, it wasn't the biggest place in the world, so it probably didn't take them too long to figure out where we were. It was odd, but nothing worrisome. We invited them to hang out after I ran in and asked my mom if it was okay if they did, and she said it was just fine with her. I got some stuff for s'mores and then went back outside, and Julie was laughing as Chris was telling some story, and we were all just kind of hanging out around the fire. When it was about midnight, my mom softly called out and said the boys had to go back to their campsite, and we needed to come inside. They asked us if we would like to get together again the next day, and Julie, being really coy, said, "We'll think about it." We ran inside laughing and got ready for bed. We whispered into the night until my mom told us to shut up and stop being boy crazy. The next day we had breakfast, took showers, and that's when I swear there was a face in the little roll-up window at the back of our trailer. It was only there for a second, and I couldn't be sure who it was or if it was just a shadow. I thought to myself, don't get carried away. It could have just been anybody walking by, even one of the groundspeople. We had this white golf cart with a canopy that we drove around to go to the store or the rec center or wherever. I already mentioned that most people had them who were there for the summer. So we were surprised when Chris and Brad pulled up in a golf cart. I asked them, "You got a golf cart all the way here just to be in your pop-up camper?" Brad kind of smiled and said, "You want to go for a ride?" Of course, because we thought they were cute, we said, "Okay, let's go to the rec center." So off we went, parked the golf cart before going inside to play more ping pong and games and stuff. A little while later, we heard another golf cart pull up and slam on its brakes, pushing through the gravel. We heard some voices say, "It's right here, but how the hell did it get over here?" Julie and I looked at each other, but we didn't notice that Brad and Chris had made a hasty retreat out the back door of the rec center until we turned around. In came the superintendent of the facility. He was a really nice guy that I'll refer to as Ben. Our family had known him as long as we had been there, and he was just a really cool guy. He came in and asked us if we knew how that golf cart got out in front. We were the only two in the rec center at the time. Obviously Chris and Brad had taken off. We lied and said no, and Ben said okay, and then another guy came in whom we'd seen for many years at the campground but didn't really know his name, and they started talking. Apparently, the golf cart had been stolen out of his trailer's shed. It didn't take a genius to figure out who did that. And that's the thing that still kills me. If those guys wanted to drive around, they could have just asked us, and we would have taken them around in my family's golf cart. But that's not the kind of guys they were. We were about to find that out really fast. After Ben and the man left, we decided to walk back home. On the way, there was this little wooded area, and as we were walking by it, just talking about Brad and Chris, we heard a whisper, and we saw both of them standing inside the tree line. They were standing in a little clearing, just after the road and after the first set of bushes and trees. We followed a path into where they were standing, and I immediately said, "Did you steal someone's golf cart?" And Chris immediately said, "No. Mr. Smith said we could borrow it." I then said, "Well, then why did you run off when Ben came up to the rec center?" He said Ben and Chris had cigarettes on them, and they weren't supposed to have them, and they were worried about getting in trouble. Kind of a lame excuse, like, how would anyone have known that they had cigarettes? But being foolish young girls, we let it slide. And of course, then we all decided to have a cigarette, even though I had never smoked before. Julie had smoked and was trying to teach me how to inhale, and I did, and I immediately coughed, but then started getting the hang of it. I had another one, and I remember they were menthol cigarettes. After the second one, I felt sick as a dog, and Julie said we needed to go home. Chris and Brad stayed in the woods, but Julie and I went back to our trailer, and I had to lay down after drinking some water. I felt terrible, and it was like the entire trailer was spinning. My mom had left a note that Julie read aloud and said that she was going to visit a friend on the other side of the pond, but would be back in the afternoon, and we could just make our own lunch. So Julie said she was going to the store and get me something for my stomach, which I kept complaining felt terrible. I heard her get on the golf cart and drive away, and I just lay there with my eyes closed because if they opened up, it made me feel even worse. Then I heard my trailer's screen door open, and I thought it was Julie, but I found out how wrong I was. I said out loud, "Oh my God, I don't feel well," but a hand clamped over my mouth. I tried to get up, but the same set of arms pushed me down on the little couch that we had inside the trailer. I opened my eyes to see Chris standing over me, and Brad right behind him, who started to try to pull my pants down. He was holding onto my legs, and I was starting to scream, but Chris's hand over my mouth kept me quieter than I should have been. It was then that I remembered our closest neighbor wasn't there that week, and outside of how bad my stomach and head felt, I went into full-on mode that I was going to be raped. I started kicking and thrashing and finally opened my mouth up enough to bite down onto Chris's finger, and he yelled out. He raised his hand like he was going to smack me in the face while Brad was still fumbling with my pants. And I kicked out and got Brad in the balls, and he backed off, and Chris just said, "Do what we say and it'll be over quick. I promise it'll feel good." Yeah, that sounds about right. I fought his hand off of my mouth, and I started screaming my head off, and he tried to get on top of me, but I was already sitting up, and I could hear Julie coming back on the golf cart. I screamed out to Julie for help as she ran inside, and Chris and Brad went out the door between the kitchen and my parents' room as Julie was coming in through the front door. I was shaking and crying, and Julie kept saying, "What's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong?" I finally told her what had happened, and she said, "We have to get your mom right now." There was no massive damage to me, and my head was suddenly clear, and my stomach no longer felt bad because of the cigarettes, but I felt so scared and was in full fear of my life. I told her that I just wanted to close all the doors and windows and wait for my mom to come home. She eventually agreed, and that's what we did. My mom got home a little while later, and I told her everything. We told her about the stolen golf cart, and we told her about where these guys said that they were staying. My mom said to stay inside with the doors locked, and she was going to go find Ben. After a little while, she and Ben came back, and he asked me what they looked like, along with what Julie's description was as well. We told them everything, and that they were staying in a pop-up camper, and that's all we really knew. Ben looked at my mom and then said, "Okay, girls, settle down. We're going to take care of this." He called the county sheriff, and the sheriff came out, and they had a conference while Julie and I sat inside. Both of them walked away, and my mom just held me in her arms and told me that everything was going to be okay. By this time, I was calming down, even though I was scared for my life and my goodies. I only made out with a couple of boys by that time in my life, and I was not ready for anything more than that, and certainly no person is ever ready to be a victim of rape. My mom called my dad, and I could hear him yelling into the phone. I mean, not at her, but just in general frustration and anger. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but I could tell he was worried about his little girl, and very, very angry. Ben and the sheriff came back, and my mom went outside with her phone, and they talked away from the trailer. Julie opened one of the windows, which was nice because it was hotter than heck in there, and we hadn't turned the AC on. She just listened as I sat next to her, listening as best as I could, too. Brad and Chris were not staying at the campground. There were no pop-up trailers on the open campsites, just tents and other families. Ben and the sheriff went from site to site asking if anyone who knew Brad and Chris were, but none of the people staying there did. We didn't know what to think. I overheard the sheriff say it could be some young guys from the area because even though it was a rural place, there were still farms and houses out there. He said that he would do a sweep as best he could, looking for them, and just ask around if anyone knew who they were or had seen them in the last couple of days. My dad and brother cut their trip short and drove out to be with us, and I felt so much safer with my dad being there. My brother was younger than me, and though he did grow into a giant, at the time he was not the biggest of kids. My dad was the biggest one. Dad did take me for a ride on our golf cart 2 days later, and we went to a remote spot in the pond where usually only people would go fishing. He sat and held me and told me a lot about life that I had never thought about. He said, your mom is going to tell you more things, but I want you to understand that you can't trust everybody. No matter what the guy looks like, no matter how smooth he is as a talker, you can't be too sure about who he really is. He then told me that I was his angel, and that he would never be overbearing, but he also had to be protective. I really appreciated that he did that away from my family and Julie, and he still is my guardian angel. The sheriff came back later that day and said that no one in the surrounding area knew who those guys were. They didn't live in the area, and no one that they talked to had any visitors over. To this day, we have no idea where those guys came from or where they went. Without being too harsh, and I don't know if either of them are still alive or where they are, but I hope eventually they both go to hell. The Bitch Who Hated Skateboards, submitted by CeeLo Jones. Uncle Jay, I heard you like skateboarding. This is short, but here's a story about this crazy bitch that lived up the street from me and my friends. I live in the suburbs of our city, and at the end of our street there's a cul-de-sac. Right behind that is a town park with a skate park open to everyone. Scooters, BMXers, and us skaters. Everyone is always chill, but this one time me and my mates were just hanging out after a while, and this fat lady came storming up to us. She was yelling at us about hurting her kid who had been out there with us. We had no idea what she was talking about. That she was sick of older kids harassing younger kids at the park. Before we could say anything, she grabbed my friend Steve's board and ran screaming over to the chain link fence that surrounded the park, raised it over her head, and then smashed it in half. All of us, there was maybe like 6 of us, looked at each other, and Steve got up and ran at her saying, "What the fuck?" She turned around and threw the board at Steve, but he jumped out of the way, and he kept saying, "What the fuck, lady? What the fuck?" By now, we had all jumped up and were ready to protect ourselves, but we were also kind of scared. This woman was out of control. She tried to grab my friend Dizzy's board out of his hands, but he backed up in time. My friend Todd got on his phone and called 911 because this woman was so far gone, and while he was on the phone, she pulled up her sweatshirt and there was a gun in her waistband. She kept saying, "You want some of this, bitch? You want some of this?" We were scared, and I told everyone to run. She then pulled the gun out and shot into the air twice, and we took off even faster. She started laughing and kept shooting. We all ditched over the fence and ran back to my house. Todd had hung up on the phone, but we were still scared, and that woman was just crazy and scary. My parents weren't home, so we all kind of relaxed for a bit, and I broke a huge rule in my family and got everyone a beer out of the garage refrigerator. And then I gave Steve my little bros board. He didn't like skating anyway. We all caught our breath and had a beer, and again, I don't condone underage drinking, Uncle Jay, but we decided to just skate in the street for a little while before everyone had to go home. We were just out there trying kickflips and seeing who could ollie the highest, when this car came screaming down the street. All of us had to literally jump out of the road and onto the grass as we saw the same crazy woman barreling on by us. She almost hit Steve and was screaming out the window as she drove by. I told everyone to go into my garage, and a few seconds later, this woman came screaming by in her car again and then jammed on the brakes. She backed up and then sped into my driveway with her bright lights on. She came to a stop, got out, and going bonkers, started yelling about us harassing her kid. I was about to call 911 myself, but the earlier call had done its work. A cop pulled up and turned his lights on when he saw us. He got her away from us, and we yelled that she had a gun, and the next thing we knew, she was being arrested and 3 other cops showed up. We were all shitting bricks, but also feeling better knowing we were safe. My parents pulled up and wanted to know what the hell was going on, but one cop pulled them aside and told them what was up. My dad stood with the cops for a while, and then another cop came over to ask us a bunch of questions. We told him what happened, and he shook his head as he took notes. After a while, The cops took off and the woman's car was towed out of our driveway. My dad told my friends he'd drive them all home just to be safe, and later that night he told me the woman had been drugged up on something and that her kid was actually with his father about an hour away. I guess he was at the skate park there and was being bullied by some other guys, and the woman was just messed up and confused. I have zero idea what happened to her, but we haven't seen her since this happened. Oh, bonus, the gun she had was stolen. Thank heavens that none of us got hurt by that crazy lady. We just want to skate and not ship bricks like we did that night. Fuck, man. Nutjob on the Beach, submitted by Bob the Hunter. About 10 years ago, my wife and I traveled to see my family in Florida, outside of Coral Springs. We just gotten married, and it was kind of a honeymoon sort of thing as well. We took 1 week to visit with her parents, and then stayed at a resort on the beach for another. Long story, and it has nothing to do with this, but if people are wondering why we were seeing her parents right after the wedding, they couldn't make it on her special day up north. And to be honest, we kind of eloped. One night, after a dinner, my wife wasn't feeling so well and wanted to just crash in our hotel suite. I was feeling restless and told her I was going for a walk on the beach. She just said to be safe and make sure that I still had my cell phone on me. I gave her a kiss and headed down to the water and the dark. It was about 11 p.m. I was surprised there were still people out walking on the beach, enjoying a fire, but then again it was in the summer. There were both people just walking around, playing by the fire, and kids chasing sand crabs all over the place. I was enjoying myself when I got away from the resort area and things quieted down. After about a mile away, I was getting ready to turn around when I saw this figure walking towards me. There was no one else around, and I was super relaxed, so I figured I'll just keep walking for another half mile or so and then turn around. The guy got closer, and I noticed that he was about in his 50s or 60s, and he was in really good shape, wearing a muscle shirt and a bowler hat with some feathers in it. When he got up to me, he waved and said, "Hello, beautiful night, right?" I said hi back and agreed it was a very pleasant evening to be on the beach. He then started walking with me back the way he came and asked if I was from the area or visiting. I told him that I'd just gotten married and we were down visiting family, but spending time on our own, and we were from Connecticut. He got very quiet, and then after a few more paces, said that he was going to head home. I said, yeah, I should be heading back myself, but it was nice meeting you. Have a great evening. I turned around and started making my way back to the hotel, just listening to the waves crash and dodging the sand crabs that were scattering all over the sand. I made that half mile back to where I'd first spotted the guy, and that's when I heard footsteps, or more like feet on wet sand, pounding, coming up from behind me. At that point, I thought it was probably just some kids, but I turned, and the immediate impact was unbelievable. It was the guy in the hat. Before I could do anything, he tackled me and started pushing my head into the sand, screaming all kinds of stuff about the Bible, and tons of things I couldn't understand at all. At that point, I was just fighting back, trying to get this guy off me, and eventually did scramble away and pushed him off with one of my legs. He screamed that all people from the north were evil and that we needed to stay where we belonged. He was now getting off his butt, but went down on all fours like he was a football lineman, getting ready to jump on a play. I got up as quick as I could, but he again launched himself at me, quoting some Bible verse that I can't remember. Before he could get to me, I stepped out of the way and he tripped over my foot, and I swear that was an accident. From my perspective, I was just trying to not get tackled again. I didn't want to hurt the guy. He got up off the sand, and as I was trying to get around him, he screamed out, "Jesus has given me the power to drive out demons." He didn't move. I didn't move. We kind of just stood there looking at one another for a minute. And I said, "What a wonderful blessing." And all of a sudden, he changed his demeanor and was back to being the nice guy I had just met a few minutes earlier. Again, he asked me if I was from the area or visiting. This time I told him I was from Coral Springs, and he smiled and said, "That's a fine area." Then he started walking away again, back the way he came. I decided my walk was going to turn into a jog to get away from this guy once and for all. I started going back to the resort, and not long after, I heard that wet slapping sound again. Knowing what was going to happen, I looked over my shoulder, and there he was running up behind me again. I kicked it into high gear as he started yelling more things about Jesus' will and power over demons. Like I said, he was in good shape, but he was not as good a runner as me, and the space between us got bigger and bigger. I finally got back to the resort area, and there were thankfully still families out, enjoying the beach fire and chasing crabs around. I slowed down and looked back. The guy was nowhere in sight. I went into the hotel, got up to my room, and shut the door. My wife was looking at me like, what happened? I was covered with sand, kinda wet, breathing heavily, sweating profusely from this impromptu road race. Plus, it was the summer. Florida does get hot and humid. I told her everything that had happened and then jumped into the shower. When I came out, my wife was actually laughing and made me laugh about it too. At the time it was happening, it was terrifying because I had no idea who the guy was, and I had no idea if he had anything on him that could hurt me or if he had other intentions to give me any bodily harm. The next day, I mentioned it to the guy at the front desk after we were getting directions for a place to go for breakfast. The guy laughed and said, "Oh yeah, that's Crazy Larry." He asked if he had bothered me, and I said, "Yeah," and I told him the whole story. And he said, "Well, you got off lucky. He's been arrested a number of times for messing with people on the beach. During the day, our security is on high alert for him, and he's not allowed into the resort property, and we kind of enforce that out to the beach, even though it's not legal." The guy went on to say that about 10 years back, Larry attacked a young guy around my age and sliced him up with a knife pretty good. How a guy like that is not in jail or the crazy house kills me. I mean, people go to jail for having a little weed on them, but a true menace to society is left to do his crazy business out on the beach. I made it a point to not go for walks at night for the rest of our time there, but part of me also does want to go back sometime to see if Larry is still wandering around. If I go, I'm bringing my big brother-in-law so we know that there'll be no trouble. Crazy Larry, thanks for a very scary evening on the beach and a scary story to share. My Walmart Incident, submitted by Simeon. In 1992, I was working at a Walmart in the sporting goods section. I know a lot of people hate Walmart, and there's not a lot to like sometimes, but it was a good job, and I actually had a decent boss. The terrors of what I hear happening now were not happening back then, at least not to me. My boss kind of left me alone to do my job, and I hope I did the best that I could. Never had any issues with anyone, except for the guy I'm about to tell you about. One evening, I was just merchandising and cleaning up the shelves in my area. Yeah, imagine that, people cleaning up shelves. Last time I went into a Walmart, the place looked like a daisy cutter had been dropped in the middle of it. Anyway, this guy came up and he looked a little ragged and a little nervous. He asked me what kind of knives we had, and I said, "I'll be happy to show you what we have to offer." I showed him, pointing through the glass case, a number of items and was asking, "What exactly were you looking for, and what do you need it for?" He looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "To stab things." Trying to keep myself from laughing, I said, "Stabbing animals? Stabbing wood? Whittler?" He looked at me, still staring, deadpan, and said, "Just general stabbing." That line will never leave my brain. It's like it's tattooed there. General stabbing. I should have known that this was not going to end well, right then and there. He then said he was more interested in survival knives, like in First Blood and Rambo movies. I said, "We don't really carry anything like that, but we do have some nice buck knives, some nice Gerbers, and some Swiss Army knives." I said, "They're not really that good for stabbing, but they are really nice knives." Again, I was trying not to laugh. After a few minutes, I told him that he was probably better off going to a sporting goods store in town that would likely have what he was looking for. He looked at me for a few more seconds, reached out to shake my hand, and said, "Thanks for the advice, I really appreciate it." Then he held onto my hand for a very long time, and he was kind of pulling me towards him. It was to the point where I started to feel uncomfortable. I finally pulled away and said, "Hey, I'm happy to help." And finally he let go, turned around, and walked away. Before I left, I told my boss about it and the line about stabbing things. We both laughed about it, but later I would feel a little bit differently. The next afternoon, I went into work, and that's when the fit hit the shan. About 2 hours into my shift, let's say around 5 in the afternoon, I heard screaming coming from a number of aisles away. I left my area to see what was going on, and of course, everybody knows how big Walmarts are, so it took a few seconds to get over to where the yelling was happening. As I was going through the bathroom products, I saw a ton of blood on the floor in one aisle. I looked around and didn't see anybody, but could still hear screaming closer to our checkouts. So I kept looking both ways down every aisle, wondering what the hell was going on. A voice came over the store monitor system saying, "Call 911, call 911," and there was more screaming and yelling. I noticed more blood on the floor, but it was kind of smeared like someone had stepped or slipped in it. When I got to where all the commotion was, there were people standing in awe, and there were others running out the door. A poor greeter was still trying to do his job checking receipts and telling people that they couldn't leave without paying, and I'm not going to bust him on that. He was kind of older, and unfortunately he got the worst of this, and I'll tell you about that in a couple of seconds. I turned my head to the left, and there's that crazy guy that I'd talked to the day before, covered in blood. He was waving a brand new survival knife around. Yelling. Not words or anything, just yelling like Tarzan. He apparently came back to the store and was going to buy some shaving cream and other toiletries, and was trying to use his new knife to open the packages. We all assumed he was going to try to steal things. I suppose I was probably right, even though I never heard the end of the story other than what happened right in front of me. Our store manager came running up and told the guy to calm down. Calm down. But the guy just continued to yell. Our store manager said, "Sir, I think we need to take this outside. You're scaring our other customers." And I got to admit, man, he was doing his job pretty well. But this guy was not going to come down from where he was, and he was backing up. He looked like a rabid dog at this point. His hair was all over the place, and he just looked completely crazy. The old greeter guy decided to get in on things. I don't know why. And this crazy guy heard him coming up from behind. He spun around with the knife in his hand and sliced this old guy right across the belly. The old greeter guy goes down, and he puts his hands on his gut, and blood is starting to pour out. And I don't know how deep the cut was, but it was pretty gross from what I saw. The crazy guy then runs out the front door before anybody can stop him, and from what I'm told, he just started taking shopping carts and rammed them into parked cars. We could hear sirens coming up the way, and the police were on their way. And when they got there, we heard the guy yell out one more time. This time he was crystal clear. I could even hear him from where I was trying to help the old greeter guy with my manager. He said in a very loud voice, "You should sell these knives at Walmart." After that, the police got him contained and into an ambulance to treat his injuries, and the old greeter guy also got rushed to the hospital and ended up being okay, but had a pretty gnarly scar across his stomach. I've never seen that much blood before and was convinced that he was going to die, but I'm not a paramedic nor a doctor and obviously wasn't one back then. I guess you can lose a lot of blood and not lose your life. So we shut the store down and the police questioned everybody that was still there, including the customers. I spent some time talking to them because I had talked to this guy about knives the day before, and they told me that I shouldn't feel responsible for any of it. I mean, how was I to know something like that was going to happen? I think they said that because I did mention that maybe it was my fault for suggesting he go and get a different knife. I stayed at that job for another year before getting a different job. A job that had nothing to do with selling knives. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories, and thanks for everyone who submitted their really crazy experiences with some pretty crazy people. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you would like to hear narrated on my channel, email Uncle Josh, truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Please find me on social media, and if you haven't already, like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and also make sure that you hit the notification button so that you know every time that I upload. I appreciate all of your listenership, And thank you to those who have become Patreons. The next time we do a live campfire, you are going to be getting your shoutouts. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.